everyone. So today I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about working with data, particularly practices for saving your data. A lot of times when we are doing research, we get more focused on the analyzing the data and getting our results. And there are some things that we can do early on when we're actually saving and working with the data that could help us later on avoid a lot of time wasting issues. So the aims and objectives of this talk are to talk about how to organize your data in the most efficient way, ways that you might consider naming your files, and the idea of backing up your files somewhere besides on your laptop. Okay, so the first time I did a research project, nobody had really taught me how to save data. We had talked about how to analyze it and the results, but not really best practices for keeping a record of what you did and where you got things. So the first time I did a research project, I had one file. I had one data file that I put the data in that I collected. It was the same file that I made all my changes to with recoding and transforming things and adding variables to. And it was the same file that I did all my analysis on. Now, thankfully, at the end of the project, that one file was all I needed to get through this. However, there are a lot of issues that could have come up in that project and have come up in other projects along the way that have resulted in me learning some things that are better to do with your data just in case. So some of the things that I did not do along the way are save the original raw data or keep a copy of that. I also didn't save a copy of the initial data set that I built to conduct my analysis on. So I had no idea what the starting point was that I made all the changes to. I also didn't have any notes about the changes that I made and when I made them in the process. Now, things that you should do to help you save a lot of trouble later on. So the first thing is save the raw original data, okay? Create a folder and put the original data that you are working with in that, and don't touch it, leave it alone. Okay, you can forget about it if you want, but there are reasons that you're going to want to save that. So why you might want to actually save the original data? Well, one, if you're working with secondary data, there might be version updates that occur, and if you don't have a record of the version you started with, you're going to have issues trying to map the data you have onto the data that's currently available. If you conduct your analysis on a particular data set, and you have a certain vintage or kind of version of the data that was available at one time, and somebody else wants to conduct similar research to you, or you do again want to update your data, you need to understand which version you worked with. If you don't have a record of the vintage and somebody else tries to reproduce your research with a more recent vintage of the data, they might get slightly different results, and this can cause problems when they come back to you and say, why did I get this number and you have a different number? By presenting the vintage, you're going to help avoid some of those issues. Additionally, data availability and access to data can change over time. If you're working with your university and their access to particular data sources, their contracts may change, and data that was available at the beginning of your project may not be available at the end of your project. So what you'll end up with is if you need to update your data or you lost something, you no longer have access to it. Whereas if you save the raw data somewhere, you can just go back to that folder, open it up, and put it back in your data set. And finally, if you're going to be doing a new project on a similar topic, you're going to probably be working with similar types of data, and you'll have already had it collected versus having to go back and find everything and put it back together again. Now, another thing you might want to do is save a copy of the initial data set once you've built it and put it together. Now, why might you want to do this? Well, one, a lot of times when we do research and we move on to a new project, we tend to work on similar themes, and so you may be able to use that initial data set. Also, data files can become corrupt later on, and you don't want to go back and open your data set and find that you can no longer access it, which means you have to go back and rebuild everything. Whereas if you have a copy of the initial data set somewhere, you can open that up and work from there. Unfortunately, user error happens a lot when working with data sets. You may drop a case you didn't intend to, you may save over a variable, you may merge things in a way that you didn't intend. And instead of, again, having to go back to the very beginning of finding the data and inputting it, you can go back to the initial data set and work from there. Now, another issue you might think about are dealing with a way of recording the changes you've made to your data. Now, hopefully you're keeping a nice clean code file of all the changes you make to your data and the order in which you make them. Now, why does this matter? One, it's good to have an idea of when you made particular changes. Did you recode something before you transformed it? Which variables did you transform together and merge? These are good things to keep a record of, and particularly the order. And again, what the actual change was. This will also help you have a better idea of which version of the data you're working with when running your models. Now, some of this can be done within your code file. But another thing to keep in mind is you're not going to want to constantly just be saving over your data set every time you make a change, because you might find later on that the change you made was not something you actually wanted to do and you want to reverse that. If you know where you made that change or what version of the data you made that change to, you can go back to the right data file. So you might start out with something in terms of saving your data as calling it original data file version 1. Then if you make changes to it, you've added a variable or you've transformed something, you might say dataset version 2 transformed variables, dataset version 3 new cases. So you have an idea of the order in which things happen, and you can go backwards through the process in your data sets. Most importantly, in terms of keeping a record of changes, is going to deal with the replication policies. A lot of journals these days are requiring you to provide your data and your code file for the tables and graphs that you produce in your paper. They want to be able to check that they can get the same results that you present in your work. If they can't, then it's going to hold up or prevent your paper from moving forward to publication. So if you have a clean record of the data that you have and the changes that you made along the way, and which version you actually ran your analysis on, it's going to be easier for you to provide the data and the code and be done with that stage right away. Now, one of the most important practical issues is to save copies of your data. Not just to save copies of your data on your laptop as you're making changes, which is important, but to save copies of your data elsewhere. So why does this matter? Well, one, hard drives crash, and I learned this the hard way the day before defending my PhD. I went to open my laptop and it didn't turn on, and I had only saved my data on my laptop. Thankfully, in this situation, it was an issue of the battery, not the hard drive crashing. But had the hard drive actually crashed, I would have been out of 4 years of data and research. You could move to saving your data as well every so often on an external hard drive, but keep in mind external hard drives can get lost and they can crash and be corrupt as well. So in addition, laptops and USB sticks, they can get lost, stolen, things like that. And again, if you're working with sensitive data, you have to be careful where you're storing it as well. So in terms of saving your data, one of the things you're going to want to do, again, is keep a copy of the raw data somewhere. It can save you a lot of trouble later on if somebody wants to see the initial data you were working with. You can provide where it came from, the date, the version of it, and the original coding. You're going to want to keep a clean copy of that initial data set because, again, you may need to go back to it to rebuild something for another project, or something may happen to the data set you're working on for your current project. You're going to want to keep a clear record of the changes made to the data along the way, and you can do this both within the code file of the changes, as well as in the title or the names of the data files themselves. And finally, you're going to also want to keep a record of the data, or keep the data stored in additional places besides just on your hard drive. Keep in mind, though, GDPR practices when thinking about saving your data on other places, particularly on servers and cloud accounts. Depending on what region the server is located in, you might not be able to keep it there if you're working with sensitive data. You might want to look for something that allows you to keep a record of version control. So even if you are using the same file name and uploading it to a server, it will allow you to have prior copies saved. So if you make a change or a co-author or a research partner makes a change, you can go back and see what existed beforehand. And you're going to want to keep an idea linked to accessibility of the data. So if you're working on your laptop and it crashes and you need to get to the data and it's on an external hard drive, but that isn't with you, you're not going to be able to access the data right away. If you have it located on some sort of cloud account, you may be able to access it through other means then. Additionally, if you're working in a research team, if you have an account somewhere online, other researchers will be able to access it at the same time. If you're interested in storing your data online somewhere, you might want to check out our Introduction to OSF talk on the University of Glasgow's online repository as well. Now, just to briefly look at some of the ways kind of the data might look, the first time I did a research project, my data looked like this, data. This was the only file I had, and if anything happened to this or any changes needed to be made in terms of what I had previously done, I couldn't do it with just this file. As my research kind of evolved, my data started to look like this. I would just have one big folder with everything dumped in it. This would be my original data. This was, let's see, the first data set here, project data. But then it starts to get a little confusing as to when changes were made. I tried to keep records, so I have a date here. This one says new, this one says updated, this one says variables. But it would be hard for me to go back and figure out when in this long line of files particular changes happened. What I've moved to since is having a slightly cleaner folder for my data. I have one where I store the original data, I leave it alone, I put it there. Okay, that's my data set once it's made. Here I have my raw data, and for some of you this might be secondary data that's downloaded. It might be survey data, and if that's what you're working with, you're going to want to also maybe include your questionnaire or your code book as well, just to make sure you have a record of what the exact question wordings were and what the options were. And then I have a project data set file where I now have my version. So here I have project data version 1. Here in version 2, you can see that I merged variables. In version 3, it looks like I've added variables. In version 4, it looks like I did some recoding of the data. And version 5 is what I'm calling final, so this must have been the data set that I used to run my models on. Now, as you go through research, you're going to develop your own style. So hopefully maybe some of the things you saw here will help shape how you move forward and things that you didn't consider before, but you're going to find what works best for you and the data you have. You're going to learn from your mistakes. You are going to make mistakes with data. It's going to happen, but hopefully once you have made a mistake, you think about how can I avoid this in the future, and then actually take action on it. I know sometimes I still don't back my data up places. If you're interested in working with your data, again, check out other resources. There's quite a few options on the University of Glasgow's QSTEP Learning repository, so check that out. And otherwise, thank you for your time and good luck on your research.